It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The sun bathed the city in a warm glow, and the usual buzz of the weekend crowd filled the air. High-end cars lined the parking lot of a bustling shopping mall, their shiny exteriors reflecting the sun's rays like jewels. But amidst the expensive Lamborghinis, sleek Porsches, and brand-new Teslas, one car stood out, an impeccable jet-black Tesla Roadster, gleaming under the sunlight, worth more than most people's annual income. It wasn't just any car. This car was the epitome of luxury, cutting-edge technology, and performance. But it wasn't the car that caught the attention of Officer Derek Mitchell. No, it was the woman behind the wheel, the woman who was driving it. Kesha Washington stepped out of the car, dressed in a simple blazer and jeans, her steps confident yet composed. She seemed like just another shopper, blending in with the crowd. But Officer Mitchell's eyes locked onto her with suspicion. A black woman driving a car like that? The math didn't add up in his mind. His instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he made his decision. "Step away from the vehicle now," Officer Mitchell barked, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp knife. Kesha paused for a moment, her calm demeanor faltering only slightly. She had seen this before, but this time it was different. She wasn't just anyone. She was Judge Kesha Washington, a respected judge in the city's court system. But none of that mattered to Mitchell. He didn't recognize her. All he saw was a black woman in an expensive car, and that was enough for him to make an assumption. Kesha raised her hand slowly, not in defiance, but in compliance. She had to be careful. The crowd around them was growing, and so was the tension. Phones were already out, recording the situation as people gathered to watch the unfolding drama. In that moment, Kesha could feel the weight of their eyes on her. The feeling of being judged, misunderstood, and criminalized for no reason other than the color of her skin was all too familiar. "Place your hands on the hood," Officer Mitchell ordered, his hand hovering near his holster. Kesha obeyed, but the sting of humiliation was hard to ignore. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It had turned into something much bigger. Kesha, however, wasn't just any civilian. She wasn't going to let this unjust confrontation get the better of her. She had dealt with injustice before, many times, both in her courtroom and in her personal life. She knew what was at stake here. This wasn't just about a car. This was about her dignity, her reputation, and her very identity. Officer Mitchell wasn't backing down, though the suspicion in his eyes only deepened as he walked around the car, scrutinizing every detail. The shiny exterior, the spotless interior, it all screamed luxury. But to him, it screamed theft. "This vehicle is worth more than you make in 5 years," Mitchell said, his words laced with judgment, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Kesha's heart sank. There it was, the assumption, the prejudice. He wasn't looking at her as a person. He was looking at her as a problem, a stereotype. She fought to keep her composure. She knew what people were thinking. Why does she have this car? How could someone like her afford something so expensive? But Kesha had worked hard her entire life, earning her place in the legal world. She had earned everything she had. And yet, here she was, being accused of something she hadn't done simply because of the way she looked. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see registration, insurance, and proof of purchase for this vehicle," Mitchell continued, his voice as firm as ever. Kesha glanced around the parking lot, noticing more people gathering around. Phones were being raised, capturing every moment. Amara Johnson, a college student nearby, had already started recording the scene live on her TikTok, and the number of viewers climbed by the second. The whole world was about to witness this. Kesha's phone buzzed against her hip. Chief Justice Thompson, her boss, the one person she needed to be with right now, at the courthouse. But she couldn't answer, not while her hands were pressed against the hood of her father's car. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Every second felt like it could tip the balance between resolution and escalation. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Kesha knew one thing for sure. She had to stay calm. Mitchell wasn't going to make this easy. But Kesha wasn't the type to back down. Minutes passed, but to Kesha, they felt like hours. Mitchell kept circling her like a predator, his suspicion not letting up for a second. The crowd kept growing, and Amara's live stream numbers kept climbing. The whole world was watching. But Kesha wasn't going to let them see her break. She wasn't just any judge. She was a woman of power, strength, and intelligence. She had spent years climbing the ranks in the judicial system, and today, she wasn't going to let anyone define her by their biases. "Ma'am," Mitchell continued, his patience wearing thin, "I need you to empty your pockets." Kesha looked down at her hands on the car's hood. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of showing her fear. She wasn't going to give him anything. She knew her rights. She knew the law. But would it matter in a moment like this? Kesha's mind was racing. She had to get out of this situation. There were too many eyes on her. Her father's car's legacy was in the spotlight, and with every passing second, it felt as though the situation was spiraling out of control. Mitchell wasn't backing down. He was already preparing for a deeper confrontation, and Kesha had no choice but to remain calm. But she also knew if she made the wrong move, everything she had worked for, everything, could be shattered in an instant. As the crowd continued to grow around them, Kesha stood there, her hands still pressed firmly against the car's hood. She could feel the heat of the afternoon sun, but it wasn't the weather that made her feel warm. It was increasing pressure. Every moment felt like it stretched on forever. Officer Mitchell circled her like a hawk, examining every detail of the car, scrutinizing her every move. He was looking for something to confirm his suspicions, but Kesha knew the truth. There was nothing here but a woman who had done everything the right way, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her mind was racing, but her exterior remained calm. She could hear murmurs from the crowd, people exchanging confused glances, but she couldn't afford to pay attention to them. The tension in the air was thick. A few people from the crowd had even started to call out their opinions. "This doesn't make sense," someone whispered. "They're profiling her," another person said. The words stung, but Kesha refused to let them show on her face. She had spent her entire career in the legal system, fighting against the same kind of prejudices she was experiencing right now. But what hurt even more was how quickly people jumped to conclusions. The thought that a black woman couldn't possibly own such an expensive car was as old as the biases that ran deep in this country. The moment felt like it was spiraling out of control. Kesha's mind drifted for a moment, remembering the times she had faced similar challenges. From her first days in law school to her rise in the courtroom, she had always had to work twice as hard as her peers to prove her worth. But now, here she was, proving herself once again, not in a courtroom, but in a public parking lot, surrounded by people who had already decided her fate. And then her phone buzzed again. It was a call from Chief Justice Thompson. Kesha's heart skipped a beat. She had missed so many calls already. The emergency judicial conference, the one Kesha had been rushing to, was still in session. The conference was critical. It was about landmark legislation on police accountability, the very issue she had fought for throughout her career. Her vote was a deciding factor. She couldn't afford to miss this vote. But how could she answer the phone with Mitchell still breathing down her neck? She could hear his voice again, louder now, as he demanded proof of her ownership of the car. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle while we continue this investigation." Mitchell insisted, his tone firm, as if he was the one in control of the situation. "I can't step away. I'm not doing anything wrong," Kesha said calmly, maintaining a sense of dignity in her voice. Mitchell didn't hear her. His focus was solely on the car, and that was when the next moment of irony hit Kesha like a wave. The words that came next were as predictable as they were troubling. "This car is worth more than you make in 5 years, ma'am," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with judgment. "How do you explain that?" It was the same old story. The car, the woman, the assumptions. Kesha had heard this narrative before, but now, as a respected judge and an advocate for police accountability, the irony wasn't lost on her. She had fought for years to ensure that the legal system didn't work this way. She had fought for fairness. And yet here she was, caught in the very system she worked so hard to fix, accused of a crime she didn't commit, simply because of how she looked. The crowd murmured again. A few people seemed to be taking her side, judging Mitchell's actions for what they were, racial profiling. The conversation shifted. People weren't just watching the scene anymore. They were starting to form opinions. And Kesha was keenly aware of it. The eyes of the crowd, the cameras on her, the phones recording every word. It was all adding pressure. Pressure she hadn't expected to face in this situation. But Kesha had learned how to handle pressure. She knew that she couldn't let Mitchell's assumptions and the crowd's judgment determine her next move. She had to think quickly. Her thoughts raced as she realized the situation wasn't going to resolve on its own. Mitchell wasn't going to back down. The longer this dragged on, the more her time slipped away. The conference was happening right now. Her vote was needed. Kesha felt a rush of clarity. She knew what she had to do. "Officer, you have no right to accuse me of stealing this car," Kesha said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I'm going to need you to back off. Now." But Mitchell didn't back off. His pride, fueled by his assumptions, kept him grounded in his decision. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," Mitchell repeated, his hand now resting on his radio, signaling for backup. The sirens, the backup, it was all happening too fast. Kesha could feel the situation slipping further from her control. She wasn't some random person who could be accused of something like this. She was a judge, a respected one. This wasn't just about a stolen car. This was about an officer's abuse of power. Kesha couldn't stand idly by anymore. The time to act was now. But how could she prove who she was without escalating the situation further? And that's when she realized she had the power to end it all right now. With deliberate precision, Kesha reached into her blazer pocket. The crowd held its breath as she pulled out her leather portfolio, and with a soft snap, it opened. Inside, there were documents. But there was one document that mattered more than any of the others. The silence in the parking lot grew heavier. Mitchell's eyes locked onto the papers in her hand. He had no idea what was coming next. Kesha could feel the energy shift as she slowly slid a specific document from her portfolio. With one hand, she held her judicial ID card out for Mitchell to see. The seal of the Superior Court of California glimmered in the sunlight. And just like that, everything changed. "Officer Mitchell," Kesha said firmly, her voice echoing in the now-silent parking lot. "I am Judge Kesha Washington of the Superior Court Criminal Division. I've been on the bench for 15 years. And this car belongs to my late father, Judge Robert Washington." There was no denying it now. The document in Kesha's hand, the judicial ID, and the unmistakable presence of a judge were all the proof anyone needed. But Mitchell, still shocked, stood frozen. His mind had been so focused on the prejudice that had driven his actions, he didn't know how to respond. And that, in that single moment, was when everything shifted. The moment Kesha flashed a judicial ID was nothing short of electric. The tension in the air seemed to evaporate as if a weight had been lifted. For a split second, the crowd stood in stunned silence. Mitchell's face paled as he looked at the ID, his eyes darting between the document and Kesha's composed face. He seemed to be searching for something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. His suspicion was now slowly melting into disbelief. Kesha wasn't just a woman accused of theft. She was a judge. The reality of the situation hit Mitchell harder than anything else. How could he have not known who she was? How could he have made such an enormous mistake? His grip on the situation was slipping, but his pride kept him rooted. He couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened. "Judge Washington?" Mitchell's voice wavered, struggling to find his usual authority. It was clear now that he was out of his depth, and the crowd began to murmur once again, but this time with an entirely different energy. Kesha, in the calmest voice imaginable, responded, "Yes, Officer Mitchell. I am Judge Kesha Washington of the Superior Court Criminal Division, and this car belongs to my late father, Judge Robert Washington." The crowd gasped in unison. The name was enough to change everything. Judge Robert Washington was a legendary figure in the legal community. His name carried weight, respect, and authority. But for Mitchell, all that mattered was the moment of realization. He had just accused one of the most powerful women in the state of something she hadn't done, something he had no right to accuse her of in the first place. "Ma'am, Mitchell began, but his words faltered. He was at a loss, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had made the worst mistake of his career, but the damage had already been done. He had publicly humiliated a sitting judge and subjected her to racial profiling. There was no turning back now. Kesha could see the shift in Mitchell's expression. The mask of authority he had been wearing was slipping away, revealing a man who had just realized the full extent of his error. But Kesha wasn't about to let him off that easily. She wasn't going to let this moment slip by without addressing the issue at hand. She had worked too hard for too long to let an officer's prejudice go unchallenged. "Let me make this clear. Officer Mitchell," Kesha continued, her voice firm but composed. "This car is my father's, and I am his daughter. There's nothing stolen about it. But what is stolen is a trust one put in this system, a system that, time and time again, fails people like me." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The crowd was silent now. Every eye locked on her. Kesha wasn't just speaking to Mitchell anymore. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin or the assumptions people had made about them. This was bigger than just one officer's mistake. It was a reflection of a larger issue. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "you've just proven why we need police accountability, why we need transparency in law enforcement, and why we need to confront the biases that run rampant in the system. What happened here today wasn't just a mistake. It was a clear example of racial profiling." Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but Kesha didn't give him the chance. "No, officer, I'm not interested in your excuses. You saw a black woman in an expensive car, and you immediately assumed I had stolen it. You didn't take the time to ask questions or listen. You jumped to conclusions based on nothing but your own biases." The weight of her words hit harder than anything Mitchell could say in his defense. For a moment, Kesha felt the eyes of the entire crowd on her, and she realized this wasn't just about her. This was about the broader issue of racial profiling in America, something that had been ignored for far too long. And now, the whole world was watching. As she spoke, Kesha's mind raced. She knew the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just a public spectacle. This was a moment of reckoning. If she didn't speak out now, if she didn't demand change, the cycle of prejudice would continue. The crowd began to stir again, murmuring amongst themselves. Kesha could hear phrases like, "This is why we need police reform," and "She's absolutely right." The power of social media was at play, and Amara's live stream was still broadcasting the entire scene to thousands of viewers, if not more. Amara had been recording the entire incident from the beginning, and now her stream was reaching over 50,000 viewers. Comments flooded the screen, pouring in faster than anyone could keep up with. There were messages of support for Kesha, condemning the officer's actions, and many expressing outrage over the racial profiling taking place. But there was also a sense of disbelief. "This is insane," one comment read. "She's a judge. How did they not recognize her?" Another said, "This is why we need more accountability in policing. No one is above suspicion, but assumptions like this are dangerous." As Kesha stood there, facing Mitchell, she couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency building within her. She knew she couldn't let this moment pass without making the point clear, both for her own dignity and for the countless others who have been victims of racial profiling. This was her chance to not only clear her name, but to bring attention to the larger systemic issues in law enforcement. Mitchell stood frozen, still unsure of how to proceed. His backup had arrived, but now it was clear that the situation was far from simple. What had started as an accusation of a stolen car had quickly escalated into something much bigger, a confrontation that could have far-reaching consequences for his career and the department he worked for. "Don't you see, Officer Mitchell?" Kesha said, her tone softening just slightly. "This isn't about the car. It's about how we, as a society, have allowed this kind of thinking to persist. We've allowed people to be judged based on nothing more than the color of their skin and the assumptions that come with it. You didn't see me as a judge. You saw me as a threat. And that's the problem." The truth hung heavy in the air. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for Mitchell to respond. But he didn't. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. And just when it seemed like Mitchell might try to deflect or deny the gravity of the situation, Kesha pulled out one final piece of the puzzle. The document that would seal the deal. "This car," Kesha said, flipping through her portfolio, "was transferred to me from my father's estate. Here's the registration. You wanted proof, officer? Here it is. She handed Mitchell the document, and for the first time, he took a step back. The weight of the situation was sinking in. He had been wrong. There was no escaping it now. But Kesha wasn't finished. She knew the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Officer Mitchell stood there, holding the document Kesha had handed him, his face flushed with embarrassment and disbelief. He looked at the registration, then back at Kesha, his mind still trying to process what was happening. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. This was a moment that would define his career, a moment he would not be able to undo, no matter how hard he tried. Around them, the crowd had gone from murmuring to full-on conversation. Kesha had exposed Mitchell's prejudices and his failure to follow basic protocol, and the reaction was swift. People weren't just watching anymore. They were talking, debating, and reacting to the truth that had just been revealed. The live stream numbers kept climbing. Viewers were pouring in by the thousands. Amar's phone showed over 80,000 viewers now, with more people joining every second. The comments were flying faster than anyone could read. But one thing was clear. The public was on Kesha's side. They saw through the officers' excuses. They saw the racial profiling for what it was. And they were demanding accountability. "This is ridiculous," one comment said. "How could he not know who she is?" "Racial profiling at its finest," said another. "This is why we need real police reform." The crowd's mood had shifted. No longer were they passively watching. They were invested in what was unfolding. The spectacle of a public confrontation between a judge and a police officer had become the story of the day, one that would make headlines far beyond this shopping center parking lot. And Kesha knew that the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about the future of law enforcement, about the need for transparency, accountability, and change. Kesha took a deep breath, her mind working faster than her words. She knew the next steps were crucial. She couldn't let the moment pass without making it clear that this wasn't just a case of a single officer's mistake. This was about the broader issue of police accountability, systemic racism, and the failure of law enforcement to uphold the very values they were sworn to protect. "Officer Mitchell," Kesha said, her voice carrying the weight of years of legal experience and wisdom, "you've just made a mistake, and it's not just a mistake about who I am. It's a mistake about how you view people who don't fit into your preconceived notions." Mitchell's face tightened, and for the first time, he looked like a man who truly understood the gravity of what was happening. But it was too late. His actions had already been seen by thousands, and it was clear that Kesha wasn't going to let him off the hook. "You didn't just assume that I stole my father's car, Officer Mitchell," Kesha continued. "You assumed that because I'm a black woman in an expensive car, I must have somehow gotten it illegally. You didn't bother to ask questions. You didn't bother to listen. You made a snap judgment based on nothing but the color of my skin." The crowd, which had been quiet up until now, started to murmur again, but this time it was with a new sense of understanding. They weren't just passive observers anymore. They were witnesses to something far larger than a simple case of mistaken identity. They were witnessing a systemic issue unfold in real time. Mitchell didn't respond. He couldn't. He was caught in his own mistake, and the weight of his actions was sinking in deeper by the second. "I can't even begin to explain how humiliating this is," Kesha said, her voice growing stronger, more determined. "I've dedicated my life to upholding the law, to making sure justice is served. But today, I've been treated like a criminal simply because of the way I look. And this happens every day, all over this country, to people who don't have the same platform or the same power to speak up." Kesha's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Mitchell seemed to realize that this wasn't just a personal matter. This wasn't just about him and Kesha. It was about the system he represented, a system that, as Kesha had just pointed out, was deeply flawed. But Kesha wasn't going to let the conversation end there. She wasn't about to let this moment fade away. She needed to make sure that the story didn't stop with Mitchell's apology or his mistake. She needed to make sure the world understood what had really happened here. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Officer Mitchell," Kesha said, her voice cold and controlled. "But I am here to make sure that this moment isn't just swept under the rug. The whole world is watching, and they're watching you as a symbol of a much larger problem. You represent a police system that assumes guilt based on race, that treats people like criminals without any evidence. At this, Mitchell's face grew even paler. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed truly ashamed. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if he knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't make things right. He had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. Kesha's eyes never left him as she continued. You and I both know that this isn't just about this one incident. This is about the systemic racism that has been embedded in the fabric of law enforcement for generations. It's about the fact that people of color are treated differently by the very system that is supposed to protect us. This is about making sure that something like this never happens again. The crowd, which had been quiet until now, began to cheer. The sound of applause, clapping, and shouts of support rang out. People were no longer just spectators. They were standing with Kesha. They were standing against what had happened here. They were standing for justice. Mitchell's eyes flickered around the crowd. It was clear that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a local issue. This wasn't something that would go away with an apology. The moment had transcended the parking lot. It had become a national conversation about police accountability and racial profiling. And Mitchell had unwittingly become a part of it. Now, you have a choice, Officer Mitchell, Kesha said, her voice steady. You can admit that you were wrong, that you made an assumption based on nothing but your own prejudice. Or you can continue down this path, but know that you're not going to be able to escape the consequences. This moment isn't just about your career. It's about the future of policing in this country. It's about making sure that people are treated fairly, no matter the color of their skin or the car they drive. For the first time, Mitchell's face was filled with a mixture of fear and regret. The truth was undeniable. He had done something wrong, and now the world was watching, waiting for him to make the right choice. The weight of the moment was almost suffocating. Kesha's words had echoed to the parking lot, and the crowd, now in full support of her, was waiting with bated breath to see how Mitchell would respond. The silence was deafening. Mitchell stood there, staring at Kesha, his mind racing. Every ounce of pride he had clung to for so many years seemed to be evaporating before his eyes. He had made an error, a huge one. The whole world was watching, and the implications of his next move could be catastrophic for him, his career, and his entire department. Kesha stood there unwavering. Her composure, even in the face of such intense humiliation, was admirable. She had done nothing wrong. Yet here she was, forced to justify herself in front of a crowd that had assumed the worst because of the color of her skin. She knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much bigger. It was about the truth that needed to be told. It was about shining a light on the systemic issues in law enforcement that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment. Amara's live stream had surpassed 100,000 viewers, and the comments were coming in faster than anyone could read. The viewers were voicing their opinions, expressing their anger at the situation. Some had joined the conversation, asking why such an obvious case of racial profiling was happening in broad daylight. Others were already sharing their own stories of discrimination. This is why we need reform. One comment read, "If this happens to a judge, how many others are being treated like this in silence? This officer needs to be held accountable. This is outrageous." Why wasn't he more careful? He had no right to accuse her of stealing anything. As the voices from the live stream echoed in the background, Kesha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world was finally paying attention to the problems she had been fighting for years to fix. And it wasn't just the crowd or the thousands watching online. The situation had reached a tipping point. There was no going back. Change had to happen. Mitchell had to make a choice, and the whole world was waiting for him to make it. Mitchell looked around the parking lot. The crowd was no longer just a group of bystanders. They were a collective force, united in their support for Kesha and their condemnation of his actions. They were witnesses to history in the making, a moment that could define his career, his legacy, and the future of law enforcement. He swallowed hard. His hand trembled as he reached for his radio, unsure what to say or how to address the mounting pressure. It was as if everything had gone silent, except for Kesha's voice in his head, demanding accountability. He had thought he could get away with treating her this way, dismissing her as just another person who didn't belong. But now, the full weight of his mistake had hit him like a tidal wave. The realization was crushing. He had acted on assumptions. He had profiled Kesha based on nothing but her skin color and the car she drove. But the truth was clear now. She was not just any woman in a fancy car. She was a judge, a respected figure in the legal system. And his actions had not only humiliated her, they had exposed the fundamental flaws in the system he worked for. "Officer Mitchell," Kesha said again, her voice unwavering, "you need to make a decision. Do you acknowledge what you've done? Do you take responsibility for your actions? Or do you let your pride take the reins and keep digging yourself into a hole?" Mitchell could feel the pressure mounting. He could feel the eyes of the crowd, the cameras, and the thousands watching online. He could feel the weight of his badge, the weight of the badge he had sworn to wear with honor, now a symbol of the mistake he had made. How could he move forward from this? Kesha's calm yet powerful presence made him realize something he had never truly grasped before. This wasn't just about being right or wrong. It was about justice, fairness, and doing what was right, even when it was difficult. With a shaky breath, Mitchell spoke, but his voice barely reached Kesha. I was wrong," he said, his words slow and uncertain. "I shouldn't have assumed anything. I should have listened to you from the beginning." The crowd fell silent for a moment, as if waiting to hear more. But Mitchell wasn't done yet. The realization had finally dawned on him, and the weight of his mistake pressed heavily on his chest. "I've let my assumptions get the best of me," he continued, his voice steadier now. "I see that now. I can't undo what I've done, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I will take responsibility for my actions." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mitchell's words didn't undo the humiliation Kesha had faced, nor did they erase the damage that had been done. But they mark a shift from denial to accountability. It wasn't a full redemption, but it was a step in the right direction, a step that Kesha knew could lead to change. Kesha nodded, her face still composed, but there was a sense of quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "That's a start, Officer Mitchell. Acknowledge your mistake. Learn from it. But more than that, take action. Your department needs real reform, and it starts with you. You're a part of this system, and you have the power to change it. It's time to make that change real." For a brief moment, Mitchell's shoulders slumped, and Kesha could see the weight of his decision settling on him. He had made the right choice. It wasn't easy, but it was the only one that could lead to meaningful progress. "Thank you," Mitchell said softly, the words almost too quiet for the crowd to hear. But there was no denying the sincerity behind them. He wasn't just apologizing to Kesha anymore. He was apologizing to himself, to the system, and to everyone he had failed in the past. And then, just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, it was over. The tension that had gripped the parking lot began to loosen. The crowd slowly started to disperse, but not before Kesha's words lingered in the air, leaving an undeniable impact on everyone who had witnessed the scene. But the story wasn't over yet. Mitchell had made his choice, but the road to redemption was long. The damage had been done, but this moment could serve as a turning point, not just for him, but for the police department as a whole. Real change could come from this moment, if only they took the right steps. Kesha turned to leave, her face calm and resolute. She had faced an unjust accusation, but she had faced it head-on, with dignity, grace, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her father's legacy lived on in her, and today she had honored it by standing up for what was right. But as she walked away, Kesha knew that this wasn't just a victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin, for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of who they were. Today, change had begun as Kesha walked away from the scene. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the ripple effects of what had just transpired were far from over. Mitchell stood there frozen, still holding the registration, and Kesha's judicial ID, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly, and his mind raced, processing the monumental mistake he had made. He wasn't sure how to face the department, how to explain the events of the afternoon to his colleagues or superiors. One thing was for sure. His career was never going to be the same again. Behind him, the voices of the crowd began to fade, but Kesha's words still echoed in his mind. This isn't just about your career, Officer Mitchell. This is about the future of policing in this country. He knew those words weren't just some dramatic line. They were the truth, and the responsibility was now his to carry. Back at the police station, news of the incident was already spreading. Word had traveled fast, especially with the viral nature of the live stream. Officers, detectives, and even the chief were being briefed on what had happened in that parking lot. The higher-ups were preparing to respond, not just to the incident itself, but to the growing pressure for accountability and reform in their department. They knew this was a turning point, and they couldn't afford to ignore it. While the situation was unfolding at the department, Kesha had returned to her car, but she wasn't headed to the courthouse just yet. Her phone had buzzed constantly throughout the ordeal, but the last message she received was from Chief Justice Thompson. It read, "We need you now. The vote's happening. Please don't let this go another minute." Kesha glanced at the time and then looked at the sea of people who had gathered around the parking lot. Their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and hope. It had been a moment of humiliation, yes, but it was also a moment of truth, a moment where people were finally seeing how deep the roots of prejudice ran within law enforcement. She had come to fight for justice, and even though today wasn't the ideal scenario, she knew that her fight was reaching new heights. As Kesha made her way back to the courthouse, the weight of the situation still hung over her. She had just put herself at the center of a national conversation. The reality was clear. This would be on every news outlet by the end of the day. Her face would be on television screens across the country, and the issue of racial profiling in law enforcement would once again be thrust into the spotlight. It was a battle that she had been fighting for years, but this time there was something different. This time there was a chance for real change. Meanwhile, Mitchell was in his squad car, heading back to the station, his mind still replaying the confrontation over and over again. He could feel the sting of his mistakes, and it was hard to ignore the way people's reactions had shifted when Kesha had revealed who she was. He had assumed she was just another person to be questioned. He had never once considered that she might be someone with real authority, someone whose influence extended far beyond the confines of this shopping center. The consequences of his actions weren't just personal. Mitchell now understood that they reached further than his own pride. They were part of a larger issue within law enforcement, one that affected people every day, and today, that issue had been exposed for all to see. Kesha had given him an opportunity to acknowledge his mistake, and he had taken it. But that didn't mean the situation was over. In fact, it was just a beginning. At the station, the chief was already on the phone with the police commissioner. "We need to deal with this immediately. We can't afford to let this go unnoticed," the chief said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The public's reaction is growing, and it's not just about the car. It's about what happened here, what Mitchell did, and the culture that allowed it to happen." The police commissioner, a seasoned officer with years of experience, understood the gravity of the situation. "I'm on it. We'll start the internal review, but you know as well as I do that this goes beyond just one officer. The public's trust is on the line here. We can't let this slip away." Back at the courthouse, Kesha entered the building just in time for the emergency judicial conference. She had missed the beginning, but the meeting was still in full swing. The room fell silent as she entered, her presence commanding attention. All eyes were on her, but Kesha wasn't interested in being the center of attention. She was here for one thing and one thing only, to cast her vote on a critical case that would shape the future of police accountability. The Chief Justice had asked her to be a swing vote on new police accountability measures that would mandate body cameras, civilian oversight, and more stringent penalties for officers involved in misconduct. The decision could make or break efforts to reform the system. And Kesha knew that, given the events of the afternoon, her vote was now more important than ever. "I apologize for my delay," Kesha said, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "I was caught up in a situation. But let's not waste any more time." The room, sensing her resolve, nodded in agreement. Kesha took her seat, her focus now entirely on the matter at hand. She couldn't afford to let personal emotions cloud her judgment. She had a responsibility to uphold, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been unfairly treated by the system. Minutes later, the room was in full discussion about the proposed measures. The stakes were high, and everyone knew that the vote today could change the course of policing in the state. Kesha listened intently, but her mind also drifted back to what had happened earlier. She thought about Mitchell and the apology he had made. It was a step in the right direction, but Kesha knew that accountability couldn't end with one officer. It had to be systemic. It had to be enforced at every level. After a long discussion, the time came for Kesha to cast her vote. The room went quiet as she prepared to speak. "I vote yes," she said, her voice firm and decisive. "We need these measures. We need reform, and we need it now. The time for change is long overdue." Her vote, the one that had seemed so small before, now held greater weight than ever. She had just cast a deciding vote on a landmark bill that would push police departments nationwide to adopt these measures. But the work wasn't done. It had only just begun. As the meeting adjourned, Kesha felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The system was flawed, but today she had made a difference, and she knew that she wouldn't stop until every voice, every story, and every fight for justice was heard. The world had been watching, and now the story was finally beginning to unfold in a way that could change everything. Kesha left the courthouse later that afternoon, but her mind was still consumed with the events of the day. She had voted for police reform, but she knew that her work was far from over. While the vote had passed, the real battle lay in enforcement of these new policies. And that was where the real change needed to happen. As she stepped into her car, Kesha couldn't help but reflect on the morning's events. The encounter with Officer Mitchell felt like a lifetime ago. She had been humiliated, accused of something she hadn't done, and yet in that moment, she had found her voice. She had stood up not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been unfairly judged because of the color of their skin or the assumptions others had made about them. Kesha's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a message from the Chief Justice. "You were the turning point today. The world saw what needed to be seen. Let's keep pushing for more." She smiled to herself as she read the message. The Chief Justice was right. Today had been a turning point, not just for Kesha, but for law enforcement, for the justice system, and for every person who had ever been subjected to racial profiling. But as much as the world had seen her stand tall, Kesha knew that this was just the beginning. There was so much more work to be done. This moment had given her the platform to make real change, but it wasn't just about her anymore. The moment had sparked a conversation that needed to continue. Back at the police station, the fallout from the parking lot incident was already in full swing. Mitchell had returned to the station, and his colleagues were already looking at him differently. The realization of his mistake had begun to sink in, and it was clear that his career was on the line. But the department wasn't going to let him slide. They knew that they couldn't ignore the public outcry, and Mitchell's actions had put the entire force under scrutiny. At the station, Sergeant Reynolds was already drafting a report, carefully detailing what had happened. The report was not just about what had gone wrong that day. It was about the larger issue that had been exposed. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that this wasn't just a small mistake. This was a symptom of a deeper problem within the department. It was a problem that needed to be addressed head-on. Reynolds made a call to the police commissioner, asking for an immediate review of the department's procedures and training. "We can't afford to let this slip away," he said. "We need to change the way we do things." The commissioner agreed. "It's time to make the reforms we've been talking about for years. We can't keep sweeping things under the rug. This is our chance to make real change." Back on the streets, the story was being told, shared, and discussed in every corner of the country. News outlets, social media platforms, and news anchors were all covering the fallout from Kesha's encounter with Officer Mitchell. The hashtag racial profiling had begun trending, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and calling for greater accountability in policing. Amara Johnson's live stream had skyrocketed to over 150,000 viewers, and her story was being picked up by major news outlets. She had been a key part of exposing the truth, and now her work had earned her a scholarship for journalism and a position with a major news network. Her life had changed in the blink of an eye, but she knew that the true victory was in the conversation that had started. She wasn't just documenting the story. She was helping to shape the future. As the days passed, more and more people came forward, sharing their own experiences with racial profiling and police misconduct. The public was demanding change, and they were no longer willing to stay silent. For the first time in a long while, the conversation about police reform wasn't just a political talking point. It was a movement. People were marching, signing petitions, and showing up in ways they never had before. Kesha, for her part, remained focused. She knew that the work was just beginning. In the coming weeks, she would testify before state legislators, pushing for the policies she had voted for to become a reality. She would work alongside other activists, legal experts, and reformers to ensure that the changes she had voted for didn't just remain words on paper. Her fight had always been about more than just the law. It had been about people. It had been about making sure that the justice system worked for everyone, not just a select few. Kesha's career had been shaped by her father's legacy, but now she was shaping her own. The world was changing, slowly but surely. Kesha's role in that change wasn't just symbolic. It was real, and it was happening before her eyes. But she knew there was still so much to do. The battle for racial justice, police reform, and accountability would not be won with one vote or one decision. It would be won by a collective effort, by every person who had ever stood up, spoken out, and fought for what was right. As she sat in her office one evening, going over paperwork, her mind wandered back to the day in the parking lot. She thought about Officer Mitchell, the shame in his eyes as he admitted his mistake. She thought about the crowd, their support, and the power of social media to amplify voices that had long been ignored. And she thought about her father, who had taught her that justice delayed is justice denied. Today, Kesha had made sure that justice would no longer be delayed. It was finally being delivered. The story wasn't over, but one thing was certain. The conversation had begun, and it was going to continue until the system was changed for good.